Hello and welcome to KingstonCitizens.org's Roundtable, What's the Process? The program's recorded and broadcast each week and tackles City of Kingston and Ulster County topics with a range of guests. Tonight, I am with one of my co-hosts, and I'll let her introduce herself in a moment. But my name's Rebecca Martin, and I am a co-founder and director of KingstonCitizens.org.
And I'm Jennifer Schwartz Berky. I'm an urban planner and have been working with KingstonCitizens.org since it was founded. And I was also a county legislator for a little while. And I live in Kingston. We all live in Kingston.
We all live in Kingston. Thanks for being here, Jenny. It's a pleasure and a privilege. And to learn more about KingstonCitizens.org, you can visit our website at www.kingstoncitizens.org. And we have a page, What's the Process page, where we are uploading each one of our programs. This is number 9. So we have quite a bit of content that we're building that we hope that you find useful if you live in the City of Kingston or in Ulster County. Next week, we're going to host Tracy Frisch, and who's a really wonderful advocate and journalist, and discussing zero waste with a topic called Why Single Stream Recycling Can't Move Us to Zero Waste. So we're looking forward to having her. But tonight, the title of our program is Comprehensive Plan Rezoning. What does form-based code mean for the City of Kingston? And we are joined with City of Kingston resident and advocate, Tanya Garment. Welcome, Tanya. Thanks for being here. Tanya, I have a little bio I'd like to read about you. And first, I would also like to say that we appreciate you serving as an advisory member of KingstonCitizens.org for many years. Your support and your work is deeply appreciated, and it's nice to have you with us talking about form-based code and to the City of Kingston's moving into this next phase of the comprehensive plan work. So your bio, Tanya Garment, has been on the course of independent study of city planning and history for about 7 years and has considered herself an activist for about 5 years. She grew up in the 70s and the 80s in Brownstone, Brooklyn, with civically engaged artist parents, and has always wondered about the workings of cities. Formerly a cook, she first lived in the Hudson Valley in the 1990s when she attended the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park. In the 90s, she moved to Kingston from Manhattan in 2015, luckily for us, just as Kingston was rewriting its comprehensive plan. Though focused on local policy, she is also tuned into national movements towards equitable, sustainable, incremental, bottom-up development. Tanya is the mother of a 16-year-old. So thank you, Tanya.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, I really enjoy being in Kingston and knowing that there are so many of us who are really engaged in the process. It's good to have teams and friends.
So, yeah. And breaking down an issue that really seems like a monster of an issue for anyone coming into the City of Kingston newly, and even just wondering how something like this works. Right. And just full disclosure, the City of Kingston's Comprehensive Planning Task Force was assembled last spring, and I was on the task force for a few months before I chose to exit from the work. So I have a little bit of experience in this new conversation. I'm glad to hear about all that you know, Tanya, and Jenny is going to help us to lead and facilitate this conversation. Jenny, where are we? What do you want to do? How do we proceed?
Well, I thought I would give just a little background, although we don't need to go into the deep history. People can read about the history of urban planning, but the form-based code that we're going to be talking about is something that a lot of cities have been taking on and adopting because they have found that the traditional Euclidean zoning, which is about 100 years old and came into being as a result of an effort in at least the United States to separate uses and to some extent separate people and build cities with very strict guidelines, separating, for example, residential from commercial and industrial, as well as, for example, uses that were considered to be a nuisance, like farming or people having pigs and chickens in their backyards. And what we found in America is that conventional zoning in the post-war era has resulted in a very isolating monoculture of sort of suburban tract development. So in a sense, it privileged the development process over the human experience in the community. And Kingston did adopt zoning, and I'm not even sure, yes, as part of its comprehensive plan in the early 60s. They did have zoning before that, but the comprehensive plan created a new era in Kingston in terms of looking at how it wanted to grow. And it has shaped the changes in the city over time, not just urban renewal, but the kinds of things that we then saw developed over time in the city. The city is one of many neighborhoods, and they are all following different patterns. What form-based code would help us do would be to sort of knit the fabric back together where there are very uncomfortable transitions between spaces that just don't work. For example, if you walk down Broadway, you know that there are a lot of empty spaces along Broadway where there might be garages or auto uses or buildings that were demolished. And for a developer to be able to come and understand how to get through the process sometimes takes a very long time. It's very difficult to get through planning and zoning, but that's true in almost any community. What form-based code does is tell you a little bit more about how that can be done. And it's a little bit more, it adds a lot more certainty to the process. So I think I will leave it at that, and then we can maybe during the course of the discussion show you some pictures and examples of how form-based code works. But what we wanted to do now was get into what Kingston has been doing and how Tanya and Rebecca and I have all been involved in some way, so that we can figure out how it can work for our community. Also, I wanted to disclose that I was on one of the teams that bid on doing the new form-based code, and it was awarded to a different team, a very good team, a nationally renowned team. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they do. So with that, why don't we start with some of our background questions? Rebecca, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it would be, Jenny, thanks for that explanation. I don't know how you did that in under 5 minutes, but you did. And, you know, I think just to bring it back into what has occurred, you know, over the last few years, right? The comp plan, the City of Kingston's new comprehensive plan was something that began, I think in around 2012 or 13, as a process where the city bonded, as I understand it, as I recall, $99,000 to undergo a comprehensive planning process and a comprehensive planning zoning process. So what happens, as you both know, is they go hand in hand. Your comprehensive plan is your community vision, and your zoning then follows up to make the community vision into the law, right? And how the lay of the land and how it's used based on the vision. And I know, and this is just, I don't know if this is significant, but maybe, I think we've come up against issues about the comp plan and whether it's a binding law or not. And we know, Jenny, right, that the comp plan, even though it's a vision, also can serve as the law. In
It does serve as a law. In fact, it has the full force of law. When you adopt a comprehensive plan, technically the zoning has to follow that vision, and it is supposed to be enacted in accordance with the comprehensive plan. So it's a form of legislative intent, like the purpose section of every part of your zoning code then needs to follow what the purpose was that was stated in the comprehensive plan.
Right. And $99,000 is certainly not enough to do both. And
No, not at all.
I think that will come up too later in terms of the costs for zoning might be surprising to community members based on what the city spent initially on the comp plan process that actually did move through some of its zoning. So Tanya, you came into town in 2015. So right in the midst, the comp plan was adopted in 2016. And I know that you were heavily involved in that process, in following it and researching it, and following as well the zoning process. So what are you want to start there? I think it would be great
Yeah.
to,
Well, it was definitely a great time to come to town, and I had been at the level of obsessed with the topic of city planning for a couple of years. Before that, I actually totally missed the comp plan part. I was settling into town, and I was trying to figure out how City Hall works, which is very hard. And by the time I started showing up to meetings and knowing which meetings you could participate at, or which meetings, or when you should talk to your older people, or how you could ask questions, they were already in the zoning part of it. But I do definitely want to say that this time in Kingston, if anybody wants to get involved and try to be in attendance at City Hall and just even to be aware of what's going on, it's an amazing time to do it, because there's a lot of possibility right now. It's a scary time because Kingston has really waited a little too long to do their zoning code, even not even counting the comprehensive plan. We're in a state right now where people have been inching up the Hudson River and moving up the Hudson River. It's becoming very popular. And now we've got the COVID situation. We're at real risk of an even larger divide of incomes and opportunities. But we're also right now, the City of Kingston is working on a lot of things that could really do amazing things if they have the proper public input. And the zoning code is a huge thing. The last time we did it was 1963 was the last comprehensive plan was passed. It was called the 1961 Comprehensive Plan, and it was put together for urban renewal. And our zoning code basically supports the goals of the urban renewal, which was to basically support the car industry and separate the uses. I think that in it says the blighting mixed uses. We want to get rid of the blighting mixed uses, but people understand now the importance of walkability, and Kingston has retained a lot of what before we had this zoning codes that did a lot of damage. We still retain it. There's a lot of stuff that it's a historic city. We've got that basic walkability of sidewalks and fine grid street patterns where you don't have to walk very far before you can turn the corner.
Tanya, just to add in too, sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting because the consultant that ushered in the 1961 comprehensive plan and zoning right, in urban renewal is the same consultant that was hired to do the 2016 comprehensive plan,
It
which
was
I
a
think is incredible, a 50-year spread, and we're working with the exact same consultant, a younger, a young Dan Schuster, and then 50 years later, the same consultant. So, I'm beyond the decision making of that. If you think about what the needs are of a community back then, where some might argue, you just brought up urban renewal. Hindsight's 2020, and what that ended up doing, in our community, one of in every community, but that coming forward to 50 years later certainly experiences something, but it's a whole other time, right? Would you say?
Yeah, and back then we were still, it wasn't only just separating uses and separating people, it was also still this mindset of growth from, we went to war after the Depression. People were coming back from war. Were we going to go right into depression, into that same sort of economy? And this idea of growth, that just keep growing. And it we ended up with a lot of sprawl and zoning codes that don't really think about making the most of our resources that we have. It's our goals are very different, and where we are is very different. It wasn't very sustainable what we were doing back then, is my point.
Yeah, the zoning. So the city did work on its zoning to reflect the 2016 comprehensive plan. And I know we want to move forward into form-based code and where we are now, but you came into the picture to at the time of that first go round with zoning, and in the end, it was I don't know if it was thrown out, if that's the right term, but it was cast aside.
Shelved, yeah. Tabled.
Yeah, it was what, tabled, but it was more than tabled. It wasn't ever coming back, right? So I don't know what to call that, but except to say it was not.
I think it was a mixture of reasons, and part of it was that they didn't really allocate enough money to do it in a way that, Kingston is a complex community. It's a microcosm in terms of, it's multi-ethnic, it's multicultural, it's multi-economic, and it has so many different kinds of neighborhoods that I think they had allocated maybe 50,000 and then another 50,000 to actually have
On
Schuster.
top of the original amount.
Yeah, I think it was, there were small incremental additions, and it really wasn't adequate for getting the zoning rewritten. So they were going to start addressing different sections of the code, and that's really what we've been left with for the last 50 years, which was a kind of incremental set of changes to the original zoning that was implemented after the 1961 plan. And it doesn't really work well that way, because it's not really thinking in an integral way. So that brings us now to the present in terms of trying to think about how to get it done. But I just also want to mention one thing, which is that it's really important to recognize that planning has also changed significantly over the course of the last century, starting out as a very technocratic thing. And in fact, when we had our guest on last week, Dan Chapley, he talked about why we have CSOs in Kingston. The planning of the city was viewed as almost like a civil engineering process. And the idea of keeping the place healthy and clean and sanitary, that was really the way that planning sort of originally came into being. It had some grand visions, but it was almost founded as a civil engineering kind of question. Over time, and it was technocratic. Over time, it has really evolved into something that has planners have taken on as a more participatory, bottom-up, as opposed to top-down process. And that wasn't true for urban renewal, but even in 2016, it was more so. So a lot of groups, invited and uninvited, came out to see the comprehensive plan that we now have, which is called Kingston 2025, and you can find it on the city's website. A lot of groups came out when it was initially introduced to bring in all of the things that they had been talking about. And one of the reasons that Tanya found such an incredibly vibrant city is because over the last 10 or 15 years, for whatever reason, probably because of the shifting economy and people moving here and people having to make do after the sort of the departure of IBM, the city of Kingston has changed dramatically. And climate change, waterfront flooding, uh, agriculture and goals of changing ideas about our food system, all of these have been incorporated into the comprehensive plan we now have.
And,
So
and
that's,
Tanya, yeah, and the on regarding the comp plan, you weren't engaged in these issues, were you, prior to coming to Kingston? And I'm curious, as we go forward, what hooked you here? What was it about comp plan zoning that interested you?
I was interested in zoning, definitely, and how cities are shaped. I I grew up in Brooklyn, and I wondered about why people really couldn't catch a break. I'd always had the experience where people just couldn't catch a break. We lived on a street. My mother wanted to start a business, but she couldn't use the property that she owned to, say, put a little gallery in the parlor floor of her house because it was residential only. There were never any opportunities for sort of starting an incubator business with what you have because there was so many regulations. And I knew that much. I knew that the regulations were holding things up for so many people, and that so many ideas that people that I knew had were not possible because you had to start off already at a quite developed level to do what you wanted to do. Own a home, have a place to live even. In Kingston, you can't have housemates in many circumstances. It's very hard to. Sometimes you can't even have housemates if you don't prove that you have on-site parking. So I think that is what made me wonder. I was at a stage in my life where my son was old enough. Some other things that were taking up my time had ended, and I had the opportunity to study this stuff that I've always been wondering about. And within a couple of years of doing that, I moved to Kingston. And here is this place that everybody's talking about it. So, and we've got the comprehensive plan is being formed. And now the next step is what are the rules that we are going to have to support this comprehensive plan, this new goals of the city? How are we going to codify that? So yeah, it was a no-brainer to be jumping in here. I ended up here for a different reason, and I picked Kingston. I wanted to move to the area for what my son wanted to do, but I chose Kingston because it's got the sidewalks. It's got what I have become accustomed to in New York City. I actually thought that it had a better public transportation system, a better transit system than it does. I moved to my block partly because it had a bus stop on it, but the sign went, and it really didn't make any difference. Nobody bothered to put it back because nobody. So there's some things and I think a lot of people who move to Kingston think that it's more city than it is. And I love cities. Cities are a place where we share resources, where you don't need a formal introduction to meet people. It's where we all intersect and where there are waves of new people coming in all the time and new ideas, and cities are great. And it also is a way that we can leave the natural realm alone. Jennifer was just talking earlier today about the transect, and that's a real basic part of form-based codes, which is, I think, originally when people were talking about nature, a way to illustrate that. But with form-based codes, you talk about what's the most intense use, and then you sort of grade out to the least intense use. And it's about the way that we are shaping our public realm. But the zoning code that we have now, and the Euclidean zoning that is across the United States, you don't get that result. I mean, it's not even in the conversation with the Euclidean zoning, but even when we think we're trying to do it with the use-based zoning, we don't get that, because something can be a LEED certified building and have bioswales around it, and have a bike lane, and have all the things that each of these really important things, you would say, oh, well, we got this, but unless you are really having a zoning code that has a predictable result, as long as we're dealing in floor area ratio, we're not going to get it. A floor area ratio is when basically it says how much floor area you should have in ratio to the land that you have. And so you could end up with one piece of land with a single story flat building that reaches the sidewalk, or you could have a bunch of parking lot or even just grass around and have a big tower. And the experience of those two different things on the pedestrian, the people who are actually on the street, not just driving through it, but experiencing the outside of it, is very different. So it's not a good way to zone. So this sort of stuff, I feel like also in terms of what is happening in the United States, these ideas and form-based codes taking on was also, I feel very lucky to have gotten into it right when I can get some satisfaction with what people are doing across the United States.
Hey, Jenny, I have a question on that.
Yes.
So just so that the listener understands that when the City of Kingston's Comprehensive Plan Task Force was assembled last spring, they met to determine what type of zoning process the city should embark upon, and to create an RFP, or a request for proposal, to find a consultant who could accomplish the goals that were set forth by the committee, that has also a common council liaison, Jeffrey Ventura Morel from Ward 1, which is good. So the city is now, can you help us, both of you, help us to understand how the city came to the conclusion now that form-based code was a good idea, and putting out an RFP to attract a consultant who knew how to achieve that goal?
Well, I would say, just to start, I'm an advocate of form-based code. I've worked in form-based code since the beginning of my career, because the first form-based code, one of the first form-based codes that was ever actually implemented, was Battery Park City, and that was my first job. And what I would say about it, the reason that it's very powerful is because, as Tanya described, instead of limiting necessarily the use on a particular lot, it's much more concerned with the way that the form of the building not only occupies that lot and relates to the shape of the streetscape, but also how it interacts with the public realm, so that it's creating an outdoor space that's very interactive for people. It privileges the public realm, and it doesn't necessarily care as much about what's going on inside the building. So, for example, Tanya's mother would probably be able, in her urban neighborhood, if it had a form-based code, obviously barring certain, let's say, limitations, like, again, maybe people don't want to live next to a house that has pigs, let's say, in the backyard. But it's much more concerned with the way that the shape of the space and the shape of the buildings. And what that does is it creates a much more lively and interesting community sort of dialogue between buildings and streets and public spaces. Now that's why I think the City of Kingston decided to do that, because if you, as I said, if you look at what has happened over the years, either it's been very difficult to get things through and a very unpredictable process, sometimes subject to a lot of interpretation, and the regulations tell you all the things that you cannot do, whereas form-based code says, here's what you can do in the shape of the space that you're given, and it gives you a much more of a kind of a recipe book. So if someone were to come along and put a building in on Broadway in some of those spaces, and I'll show you just what the kinds of things we're talking about. Hold on. So if we're talking about this kind of space on Broadway, everyone's who's watching this has driven down Broadway and seen all of these types of uses. The form-based code would actually tell you that you can't do that anymore. You can't set it back because that's not the pattern of the streetscape. I'll let Tanya take it from here.
Yeah, and when I think about these parking lots, of course, a lot of them were the part. So here we have a picture of a setback that it's not at the street. When you're walking down the street, you don't have an opportunity to look at the windows. You're just faced with a bunch of pavement, aside from the fact that it's a little dangerous to walk past curb cuts. So it's not a place that people are going to hang around. It's not going to be a place that people are going to congregate, be able to stroll, or be compelled to walk farther. So there is that problem. And when a lot of these parking lots were built, it was because there was the Midtown Businessmen's Association actually at one point, it was right before the comprehensive plan of 1961, the 1961 comprehensive plan and the urban renewal, but they were really pushing for more parking lots, and the idea that we need more parking to fix our lack of parking problem. And there were more cars, but
even back then,
actually, yeah, and really, I mean, it's like Jennifer said, it's a complex system. A city, it's a complex system, and it needs to be able to change. It needs to be able to change with the needs of what there is. It needs to be adaptable because times change, but also it is a system. And if you just put in a parking lot to answer the problem of a lack of parking, you're not really going to answer the problem. You're going to offer more parking and you're going to have more cars, but managing the amount of cars we don't have a parking management system. Not a very developed one at this point. There's the
so
beginning.
what are we looking at here? What is this?
So this is the same. This is the view from above of what you just saw,
Yeah.
and what it shows is, and I'll bring you back to this. It shows you all the pink. See the pink there? All those are voids. Those are all spaces that were created more or less by the kind of free market zoning enterprise of suggesting that maybe surface parking is more valuable than the buildings themselves, or demanding that a building would have, or a use would have so much parking that they would end up demolishing buildings in order to create parking.
Demolishing in total, or if you build a new building on that lot, chances are as our code says now, you're going to have less space that you're going to be able to put an actual building on than asphalt.
And so this is an interesting picture, just because what it shows, this was from the 2015 study of parking use on Broadway and surrounding Broadway. They were trying to understand whether or not there was a demand for more parking. And as it turns out, really there is not. There are many spaces are, as you can see in the green, so underutilized that At times, there is 0 to 29% utilization. And what you see mostly is under 70% utilization of the parking with the greens and the blues. And it's not planned out, but in form-based code, what you can do is you can actually, first of all, you can require that parking be in the back so it doesn't affect the experience of the streetscape. Or you can require that the parking be on the ground floor and somehow be hidden as a part of that. Or you can reduce the requirement for parking because you know that as part of an overall study and regime, you're going to develop shared parking spaces, but that they won't be privileged on the thoroughfare where people really should be experiencing that street as a part of their public space rather than public space for cars.
And plus, when we have a more complicated system that's recognized, we have more mixed use. We have more of a 5-minute walk to your necessities. What we have now is a separation of uses so that there's huge swaths of residential only, and you can't have a corner store. So we're actually incentivizing driving at this point too. Right. So the recognizing of the city as more complex than the Euclidean zoning recognizes it is huge.
And I think it's really important what you said, Tanya, about zoning being able to keep up with the times and keep up with the change in the ways that people live. So for instance, more and more people have been taking on either short-term rentals, the Airbnb, in order just to support themselves, in order to make their mortgage every month. Some people have had more than 50% of people in the Hudson Valley, apparently, according to some studies, are part of the gig economy, and they need to have home occupations. So how would that be accommodated as part of zoning? And then another question becomes, when people want to downsize, are they going to have to move out of their neighborhood because the zoning doesn't allow them to have accessory dwelling units, or what they call elder cottages, or granny flats, for example. These are the kinds of things, as our families and our lives change, as the economy changes, zoning needs to consider.
I have a question for you both about this, because I'm curious, back in 2016, when the comp plan was adopted for the City of Kingston, and the city chose to move forward with its zoning at that point in time, I never had heard of the term form-based code. I don't think that was on the table back then. So my question is if you don't know the history of form-based code, is it something that's more of a modern approach to zoning? We know, Jenny, you said that your first job in New York City was a project with form-based code, but I'm curious why the city is making this distinction now. Why didn't it then, do you think? And I guess I just answered my own question. This is obviously not a modern concept, but can you give us a little bit of an understanding of when form-based code, without going deep into the weeds of it? But
well, let me just, okay.
No, thanks.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the regulating, the regulations have really dominated and dictated the way that cities have been built over the last, century. And so consultants are working with what they have. Developers have to conform to the zoning that is. And when it was recognized that cities were, being sort of hollowed out by that kind of zoning, the responses they were slow. And the reason they were slow is because, it takes a while for cities to change the way they're doing it and for there to be a method. So form-based code really came about as, in a response to that, but it isn't easy for cities to change that quickly. It is more expensive to design a form-based code than a regular code because the regular code is words only and it doesn't require urban designers to come in and really look at the fabric of a community and try to understand it intimately. And also just it takes a while for communities to get their arms around doing this process differently if they've been doing it the same way for a very long time. Tanya, did you want to add something to that?
There's a book that I really like called Walkable City, and Jeff Speck, the author, talks about how the different parking regulations of different cities really are not based on anything to do with the city itself. They're just something that was taken as a one-size-fits-all from some other city. And I think most of our zoning that we've had since zoning became big has been that, a one-size-all approach. And so in order to have something that fits our city, it's going to take a lot of work. But then in the end, you have something that's much easier to understand by everybody, not just the specially trained lawyers that the larger developments are going to be able to hire. So, and also the larger developments that the lawyers that the larger developments hire are also just trying to get around the zoning code, figure out how they can just get whatever the goal of the larger projects are. But if we have a zoning code that's easier to interpret by everybody, it's a more equitable situation. So I think it's really worth the work in the front.
So it's the costs are really more of an investment, right, into the community. So because that's something that I'm not sure that the city has really done the work yet. Maybe it plans to help the community understand the costs of form-based code. And can you both speak a little bit about the investment? So Tanya, you're touching upon it a little bit, but what's the back end savings? Including the public benefits, which sometimes are hard to quantify. But I think that's really important for the community to understand. The process has been halted because of COVID. I think that the amount of money that the city is planning to spend, and maybe you both can talk about this a little bit, somewhere in the vicinity of $500,000 to do with zoning code. So it's an investment. And can you speak a little bit about that to help people to understand what that means?
Go ahead, Tanya, if you'd like.
Oh, sure. Okay. So Jennifer pulled up, I think, right? Did you, Jennifer, pull this up? Yep. The steps of making a form-based code, and I think a huge portion of it is a result of studying what the city has done in terms of plans, meeting with people from all of the parts of the city and all backgrounds and all really putting that takes a lot of work to reach out to people who really need accommodation is a big part of it too, because there are many people, there's irregular people who show up at City Hall all the time, and for whatever varying reason, they're able to make that evening meeting on their own without their kid in tow, and have the time to do their research in the back. So that's actually a huge thing to have a really good public process in developing it. Like I think Jennifer said, that drawing out of those plans and designing it so that when you look at the finished product, you're looking at it and understanding what it means is a big job, but and it varies throughout the city. There'll be different parts of the city that require different standards. So, but in the end, you're not reading pages and pages of things that sometimes even conflict because they've been patchworked together, and you end up having a more predictable result. So you're actually going to get something that is reflective of the comprehensive plan. What we have now isn't even really reflective of the 1961 comprehensive plan in reality. It's not a form of zoning that gets you what you're actually trying to get. It can end up being too many various things.
Right, because over time, and I don't want to move us off of this subject, I think it's so important. The city has spot zoned, right? Essentially, over
Yeah,
time, there's a lot of amendments to the zoning.
there have been a lot of amendments to meet perceived or real needs for change or demands, let's say, of specific groups and property owners for kinds of accommodation. So it hasn't really been that logical. I mean, it may have seemed logical at the time, but in a lot of cases, for example, where you see a neighborhood declining and then certain properties start to become, for example, fast food joints or dollar stores or whatever is going on in that neighborhood that the property is trying to adapt to, survive. For example, the property owner either selling it and then that property owner or the new property owner coming to City Hall and demanding that it be rezoned or a different use be allowed. That happens in almost every community as a result of the changing economics of place and space. And as neighborhoods rise and decline and property values change, sometimes zoning is not flexible enough. And what happens is a little bit of a hodgepodge, or can result in a pretty ugly, I mean, this is true everywhere, a pretty ugly and disruptive set of changes. It can affect and hurt the property values or the way that different zones, just it's very abrupt. For example, if you drive down Foxhall Avenue, you can see that avenue as a thoroughfare has seen better days because a lot of properties have become transitional, as it's called. And that's why, as I was referring to, I was thinking about Foxhall Avenue. And as you come down it and you see a fast food joint here and a Stewart's there and a dollar store there, that was once a much more residential neighborhood. And it, as a part of being very highly trafficked, those properties had to change or demanded that change over time.
So, yeah, but for both of you, the thing that I think is really of interest to a lot of people is, what is the investment of form-based code for? How is that? How is the community going to see the benefit of that over time?
So first of all, what it does, would you like me to just explain a little bit about how it's done?
Yeah, thanks.
Tanya for a sec, I'd love, but Jenny, please jump in. But it seems like, yeah.
I just thought about how it levels the playing field, how people can all look at it and decide what they want to do, and you actually have a chance of doing something. But you've got actually regulations that are going to benefit everybody and not inhibit things, because every neighborhood should be allowed to grow. People should be allowed to develop to the next increment of development, of intensity. If you've got a single family home, like Jennifer was talking about earlier, and your kids have moved out and you don't need the whole home, you should be able to rent out a portion of it to a young family who is just starting off and needs a small space, and be able to enjoy your neighborhood and not have to move out of your immediate community. So if you're not regulating uses, you are allowed to remain in your community. You're allowed to have a way to enter a community. It really does level the playing field. There's, if you look at Foxhall Avenue and you see that there's storefronts that have closed down. The way that our code is now, if it's a residential neighborhood and a storefront closes down, in Rondout, you can actually get a special use permit to open it up if it was originally a storefront. But in other neighborhoods that are residential, it goes out of, and even in Rondout, if it goes out of business for a year,
True everywhere.
You lose all of that grandfathered in right that was developed in a time that actually got us a more flexible place to live. And again, it's a complex system that needs to be adaptable to the times.
So before people think that that just anything can happen and that you could have, you know, like constant, for example, like too many cars or a lot of traffic in your neighborhood because suddenly you're splitting up homes and you're dividing up properties. That's not the point of form-based code. Form-based code would still look at what we looked at earlier, which is this transect, and say there are certain areas of town that allow more intensive uses, and certain areas of town that might allow less intensive uses. But that has a lot to do with the idea of trying to create a space that has a center and does have a periphery, and that does allow for what has been termed for more than a generation now, smart growth. But what it does in the first place is it creates this regulating plan. And I'm sorry, that's easier to see. So you can see that in the center where we're looking at, like there's two centers in this particular regulating plan. One is over here with the green and brown, and one is over here with the green and brown. And these are more intense uses, for example. And that as you move outward, it might allow for less intense uses. And that's based on the same idea as the transept that we were looking at a few minutes ago that Tanya was talking about. That needs to be designed with the community in mind and by a firm that understands how to look at cities and look at communities and really spend a lot of time understanding the character of each neighborhood. What that regulating plan does is it then tells you what you're allowed to build in each one of them.
Jenny, it seems like that would also be very helpful to any new project that's coming in, to be able to see how does that make development, you know, well, besides what you said, it's following the comp plan, but how does it change the experience of someone newly coming to introduce an idea to the community?
So it's easier for developers because they know what they're allowed to do. They don't have to go in front of the planning board. They do have to go in front of the planning board with the new with form-based code, but they don't have to go in front of the planning board and worry that what they've proposed, if it's actually there's a building standards, for example. If you look at this, oh, that's very small. That's not very helpful. Each neighborhood has a set of standards that that go along with that area of the regulating plan, and those standards are very, very clear, and it really does actually take the guesswork out of the process, and it's a lot easier and this is where this section, it's not very helpful. It's a clearly defined and streamlined application process so that the people who are in City Hall who are reviewing it don't have to spend as much time going back and forth with the proposer to the developer or whomever, the home builder, to haggle over what is not allowed or allowed.
And Tanya, in your experience watching these projects that come into the city, what has the experience for you been? What has it been like to witness? You know, it sounds like with form-based code, as you said, it's very clear what you can and can't do. And I think you mentioned earlier that now and maybe it was Jenny, but both, that now it's a matter of interpretation, which creates a lot of back and forth. What's your experience been like watching how the City of Kingston performs its processes based on the zoning code that we have now?
Yeah, well, a lot of it, as we have it now, is interpretation, and it really does, in my opinion, start to feel like it's by design, because our code is inherently unfair. So it's almost like a saving, sort of like, oh well, we can allow ones that we, by whoever's on the planning board or the Heritage Area Commission, decide that they want to see thrive because of whatever the popular opinion of the time is. Like we want tourism currently, or something like that. It's very subjective, and it ends up being inherently unfair. And then we have a situation where
Can I just ask, unfair to whom?
it's not a level playing field. It's not, and also they're looking at one part of a very complex system and not how it might affect the others. So for instance, the planning board, there was a property on a residential street recently. And there were some people who were moving to town. They wanted to retire here. And they were going to be slowly moving to Kingston. They live in New York City. They live in Brooklyn. They're an older couple. And one of them is retired and one of them is going to retire in a couple of years. They love Kingston and they like to retire here. They've already purchased a property. But they're not going to be out here very often. So they wanted to have tenants. And in our code, it says that you can have an accessory dwelling unit. They have a bottom floor that's not used. It's an unfinished space. It has windows within the building code. It's perfectly appropriate to have as a living space. It just needs to be renovated from the inside and have the utilities and the kitchen and the separation of uses. The code says you can only have 600 square feet. They wanted to have a little bit more because there was enough room. They could have put a 2-bedroom apartment in there. They wanted to have people on their property full-time in case there was like an electrical fire or something that happened. They wanted somebody to be basically a caretaker of their property. But there's a culture currently in Kingston that's sort of, I hope that it's fading away a little bit, but there's a culture of distrust for renters, thinking that if you can't get your act together and have a whole house, you are less predictable. And so we need people to watch the renters. And so the planning board's reason for not allowing them to go a little bit over this 600 square feet, because the code does say if there's something about your building that allows you to go over that says that more than 600 square feet is appropriate, then it's up to the planning board to allow that. And the planning board decided, no, we're not going to allow that because you're not going to be a full-time renter here. The code says it needs to be a owner-occupied building to have an accessory dwelling unit, and they interpreted it and said, well, you're not a full-time tenant, a resident here, so this is going to have 2 bedrooms. And so basically this is a situation where a family could have moved in. Somebody, a mom and her kids, could have found a place that was going to be a mutually beneficial arrangement and moved in. But because of this bias against renters, the planning board felt like they could actually say out loud, we don't want to do this because we don't feel that it's appropriate to have renters here if you don't have the landlords here full time. And it really did show this bias. And because of the way that our zoning code is formed right now, that ended up happening, and that sort of thing happens all the time. It's
probably influenced too by the neighbors, right? I bet there were vocal neighbors who.
Oh my God, one of them was politically tied, and right. And he came in and he's like,
yeah. So this is part of the problem we're saying about it not being fair, not being equal, is that it can be influenced by your interests. So, go ahead, Jenny.
Well, I was just going to say, regardless of what type of consultant and what type of approach we end up having toward zoning, whether the form-based code project moves forward or not, we're going to have to overcome some of these human conflicts. Otherwise, I have a feeling there will be it will be very difficult to actually enact the form-based code. But I just want to say about form-based code, what it allows is for a very predictable and orderly and in fact much more attractive design when something is proposed, because it is in keeping with the context. It's very sensitive to the context. And so this idea of, there goes the neighborhood, because we're going to end up with a shack next door, Um, that's one concern. But the other concern that Tanya's describing, which is sort of NIMBY, we don't want those people here. I don't know if form-based code can overcome that. I think
Well, I
that's
think that it can help a little bit, but I think that we're definitely going to need, because we've been in this sort of zoning system for so long, we're going to need some regulations on top of it, like short-term rental regulations, so that we can't, so that people, I think Woodstock did 50% of the time is when you can rent out your house. And various other cities around, towns around here have done already some short-term
right.
rental requirements, and right now in Kingston there's a proposal to have 10% across the board of affordable housing, and of course I mean I feel like that what constitutes affordable housing, and that proposal needs to be adjusted a little bit. It's but it is there, these are necessary things, because we've been in this zoning code for a long time, and
Right.
and there's a
Right, so
situation
it's sort
where
of
it's going to go
created a culture, right? Is that what you're
yeah.
saying? Does it?
Also and a scarcity for these sort of places, like Kingston is walkable. Of course, I don't feel like we have enough of a mixed use. I moved to Rondout because I couldn't afford uptown, because I would much rather have been able to walk to a store, but in Rondout we don't have a grocery. We've got a couple of corner stores, but we don't have a market that really is going to have, a variety of things. I can't go somewhere and get some flour and garlic very easily here. So it's like, and there's no hardware store. But we do have that basic, it has retained the sidewalks and enough that people, and there's a real scarcity across the United States, that people are attracted to this kind of place. Of course, also its proximity to New York City
Not to mention we have such good water, which is really something I think, it's true. Our drinking water supply is something that we control in the city.
We've got a lot of stuff that's scarce.
It's right, and it's right. It's not. It's in the New York City watershed, which is one of the, the best, or probably one of the best protected watersheds in the world. But so going forward now, COVID really put a halt to what was a process that was moving forward, where the City of Kingston's Comprehensive Plan Zoning Task Force finished their work last fall. They submitted a request for proposals. Out it went. Consultants submitted their proposal for selection. Consultant was selected. The price tag on that is $500,000. And we were moving forward, and then COVID hit, and everything has been put on hold for now. So I think, to wrap up, and thank you for this conversation. I feel like there needs to be like a series on this process, because it's so important.
There's so much more that needs to be unpacked about it.
Totally. And maybe that's something that the city is planning to do with the consultant and what have you. But for now, the reason we're bringing this forward is because we don't believe that there's been enough conversation about the difference between the zoning that we have now and how it was developed, and where we're heading and why. So with this halt on all things at the moment, what can the community expect? I guess it's all speculative at this point, given we're still in the midst of COVID. But what can the community expect, as next steps? And also, what can the community do to learn more about this important issue, if this is new to people who would love to plug in? As you said, going to meetings, etc., that can be a little bit difficult to figure out where and when and how, and when is this conversation going to come up. So what can we expect at this time going forward, in your opinions, and what can the public do in the meantime to help to support the city in making all the right decisions to try to get this on the right track?
Jennifer, did you mentioned the Form-Based Code Institute in the beginning,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
That's a
and
great
there's a plethora of very good, especially the Form-Based Code FBCI, Form-Based Code Institute online. If you just Google Form-Based Code, you will find several very good lessons. And Tanya is so passionate about it that she has dedicated probably the last 7 years to it. You've been to how many of the Congress for the New Urbanism conferences now?
Just 3 so far, but
Just three.
just 3, just the last 3. But I definitely have been listening to people who are involved in that. And there's a website called Plan Edison, and they've got the Form-Based Code 101 course on there, and so I took that. But the form-based, which you're showing now, the Form-Based Codes, formbasedcodes.org is the Form-Based Code Institute, and they're the ones who coined the term form-based codes, and that has a definition of form-based codes, and it's got award winners each year of who's redoing their zoning code, and we've got ones that are very close to us that are redoing them, and so there's that. Jeffrey Ventura Morale is the Alder person who is the liaison for the zoning task force. They're the task force put together the RFP to find a consultant, and he was the liaison from the Common Council. So he's our representative who is the most tuned into this.
So he could actually, the community could reach out to Jeffrey and request more. Maybe the task force could do some public educational forums on.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, and even the Common Council is not really up to speed on this. So that would be huge in terms of us all learning really what this is, because the task force was the mayor saying, okay, I've heard from enough constituents. We need to start over. We didn't get a lot, recognizing that we didn't get a lot done with the group that worked on the zoning after the comprehensive plan. Our comprehensive plan has a wealth of input from groups that have been working diligently on all sorts of issues in Kingston in it. There's a lot of input in the comprehensive plan, but the zoning that was done afterwards had almost no public input, and it wasn't. We ended up with we really haven't done our zoning yet, and it's so important to have this zoning. So
I would like to say also, sorry, I also would like to say that the RFP, the request for proposals, and the I'm sure all of the proposals contained a requirement, and then my assumption is that the winning proposal included a number of public workshops. Although I do think that those are going to be happening in a very compressed time, and if people want to be prepared for it and understand it better and even advocate for it, because in fact, if you look at any city that has taken on form-based code, the change is just dramatic. I think it's really important that people understand the value that this type of project would bring to Kingston. It will, in fact, encourage not only better development, but it may also bring more economic development to the city. And that's a very important factor that people need to understand about form-based code, is that it makes the development process easier. It is a lot more predictable. And I think I've already said that, but I think it's really important for people to look outside of ourselves and take a look at the communities, let's say like Arlington in Northern Virginia, South Bend, Indiana. There's so many. If you go on the Form-Based Code Institute website, you'll see the before and after.
We'll share those links too in the video so people can see.
I know I lived in Washington, D.C., and Clarendon Boulevard changed dramatically and became a place of so much, so much lively activity. As I said, mixed use and a lot of flexibility, more affordability, as well as luxury housing. a real mixture of uses. And it's right outside of Washington, D.C., which was really expanding, of course, over the last few decades. And it was very much needed to adapt that zoning. And it created such a beautiful streetscape for Northern Virginia, for Arlington County. And I think people, if they just saw what form-based code would do, I'm obviously a convert, I think they would be on board.
And development at all levels, like you were basically saying too, is it's going to allow for people to actually use their land. And in terms of economic development and having a better financial situation, it's going to allow for more use of the land that we have. So we're going to be able to have more value in the land,
That's
both
right.
for, taxes, although, I mean, maybe we need some restructuring of the way our tax system works, but
How many cans of worms if we open tonight?
Even if we did restructure our tax system in terms of, like how it's structured, it would still be a more value for the people who own the property, more ability to make use of their land and to share their land, and more protection of our natural resources.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about this too, as the public's listening about, we know right now that the council is swamped, that the city is swamped, the communities are swamped now, especially opening up during the phases of COVID. And it's almost making me think that one idea that could be good for the public is that if you're interested in this, that you could reach out to Jeffrey. It would be great to have a community advisory group who is interested in this subject to come up with ways of helping the community to understand what this is. In the same way, the city has been doing things a little differently, which I think is really smart. It's solution-based. They created even though it's council members, but they've created a special policing committee. They established a special housing committee that's outside of the scope of the committee work that the council typically does, laws and rules, public safety. And now the special policing committee is creating a community advisory group. And I think that the city is never going to be able to keep up with everything that it has to do. And the community is rich with talent that, quite often is, if it shares or has a different opinion, is brushed aside. And I think it behooves the city to start potentially think about ways of community, not just Kingston citizens or whoever else is an established advocacy group, but pockets of everyone is coming together to help to inform and support the city and its work. And maybe on that note, we can finish up, because I know it's getting late, and we've said a lot, and we will be sharing this video with a bunch of links like we do each week in the underneath the video itself, to help the community plug in and to do a little bit of work on their own. Do you have closing thoughts, the both of you, on this matter?
Yeah, just to follow up on what you said, Rebecca, I think this new effort, I think it's called Engage Kingston, right? They could probably expand on that forum to get people involved early on in the form-based code.
I do believe, though, Jenny, you're on mute. I don't know what happened. But I just want to say, before that is an idea, but I think that the Engage Kingston is the executive branch. So I think that needs to be clarified.
All right, well, that's a very important point. I didn't, so regardless of which branch it is, if there's some platform that can be opened up to asking people questions about, shared and opened up to asking people questions. In fact, it could be a bicameral effort. Ways of asking people how they feel about their neighborhoods, and the kinds of questions that this firm will be bringing to the community when they actually start doing these workshops. If there's a way of sort of getting that, getting the public educated about it in advance, if this or another platform could be used to do that,
Yeah,
I think
and
it
I
would be a
don't want to
great beginning.
suggest that Engage Kingston isn't the place for it. I just think that I like the idea of the executive and legislative branches working in concert
Right.
in, in this way. But it's a great idea, Jenny.
And we really are going to need the Common Council to. It's the legislative branch has passed it on to the Common Council. So the Common Council is also, they have a lot of work to do now. Not work, but they've got some catching up to do. They've got most of the Common Council don't understand what this is at all. So it would and we've got 9 Common Council members, and so they really represent the different wards. So it'll be really good to get them on board and understand what this is, and bring their questions forward, because there's
We're
a
going to have to communicate it into
yeah.
their wards and help the public to understand. That's why I always prefer my focus, and our focus is the council. It's 9 voices, you know, and nine wards and 24,000
And multiple
people,
neighborhoods, right?
multiple neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So thank you both for being here this evening. Jenny, as always, it's a pleasure. And Tanya, thanks for taking time to help us. And there's going to be a lot more to discuss going forward. So let this be the start. So thank you so much, Tanya.
Thank you, Tanya, for your advocacy.
Thank you. This is great.
All right, have a good night.
Okay. Bye.
We're back.
So I'm always thrilled to know members of the community who, with no other motivation but just really just giving and being connected, do the kinds of things that Tanya does, attending meetings, sharing ideas, participating in community forums, not being afraid to bring forward new ideas. This is so important, and I think she's a role model. I've said that before. She was humbled by it, but I think it's so true. If more of us would not be afraid to engage in respectful discourse, I think we'd all be better off. So whether it's about, your interest is about form-based code or recycling or clean water or policing, we hope that you will continue to do so, and even reach out to Kingston citizens to share your thoughts. We have an open forum for that.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important for people who are newly coming to Kingston to check out where you live and what ward are you in and who's your representative of that ward. And there are lots of resources that are available on the City of Kingston's website that can help you to just identify that first step, who represents you in your ward, and get in contact with them and ask questions and see
Right.
and get advice about where you might go on the issues that are important to you, and build that relationship. Because that's all we've really done over the years, and we've watched lots of council members come and go, and we've done, I think, a lot of really good work with council members, you know, over the decades. so
Ish.
Close enough. So with that, thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope you learned a great deal to get you started, and we will see you next week. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.